Hi guys, so I want to say a little thing about our old friend the longsword again, and that's particularly concerning the length of the hilts. Okay, so I've noticed that there's a trend in modern HEMA, both in the use of feathers and of the nylon swords as well, to go for the longest possible hilt you can get. Okay, well that's absolutely fine, it's allowed, and people have personal preferences. In terms of the original source material, it's an interesting topic, because if you look at the different treatises, it's very clear that some longsword manuals, treatises, use long longswords, some use shorter longswords, and the proportions of the sword vary. So very simply, something of this size we call a longsword, okay? Also known as a hand and a half sword. It's a sword that you can use just about in one hand, but that it works better in two hands. Okay? If a sword is, generally speaking, too long, too big to use in one hand, then we call that a two-handed sword, a true two-handed sword. Some people call it a Zweihander, but I don't see why we have to use German, as we have two-handed sword in English, so I say two-handed sword. So a longsword is essentially a hand and a half sword, and this is a sword that is shown in a very large number of fencing treatises from the end of the 14th century right the way through into the latter part of the 16th century. After that period, generally speaking, the two-handed swords that are shown from about the middle of the 16th century onwards tend to be very large, they look very large. There tends to be sort of a big distance between the hands, and they're used almost entirely in two hands. As you get towards 1600, you see the use of the true two-handed sword. That is the sword, if you put the point on the ground, it comes up to sort of your chin or top of your head even. And these were known as two-handed swords, or spadone in Italian, which just means big sword. So essentially the longsword, it didn't disappear and get replaced by the two-handed sword, but the two-handed sword, certainly in fencing traditions, the big two-handed sword seems to have become more popular and come to the fore, and the longsword seems to have shrunk back out of popularity, although it did still exist and it was still used as a weapon into the beginning of the 17th century even. Right, so the length of hilts. It's an interesting thing, because most longswords that you find in collections, in museums and archaeologically and so on, don't actually have terribly long hilts on them. So if we look at late 14th century and up to the mid 15th century, the sort of heyday of longsword combat, as it were, the time of Fiore and Paulus Kahl and Talhofer and Lichtenau, all of Lichtenau's students and so on, right up to the period of Vardi. Most longswords are usually about this kind of size, so actually the blade is only a little bit longer, maybe up to 5 inches longer on average than a one-handed sword, and the grip is such that you can still comfortably use it in one hand if you need to, and usually at maximum there's about 3 hands lengths that you could hold the sword with. But what we see in the modern practice of HEMA is these feather schwerts being used, and these are proportioned fairly similarly to the ones that we see in manuals, so-called manuals, actually treatises, and they usually have much longer grips, which is fine. It is historical, and there are originals like this. However, what I would say is that with any kind of weapon, there comes a point at which, if it gets bigger and bigger, you make the handle longer and longer, there comes a point at which this will become a two-handed sword and no longer really a longsword anymore. So I do see a tendency towards people going, well, I'll get a longer blade, or I'll get a longer hilt, and then the whole weapon gets bigger and bigger, and they end up with essentially a two-handed sword. And of course that's a scale whereby you think, well, at what point do you stop? And at what point does it stop being longsword? You know, if you're thinking about, oh, I want a better weapon, well then why not just use a two-handed sword, or use a halberd, or use a crossbow, or use a gun? Okay, it's not really an arms race when you're talking about fencing traditions. So my point that I'm sort of working around to, hopefully, is that I think if you're following a certain fencing tradition, you should aim to use a weapon that fits within that tradition. So, for example, I follow Fiore's system, and as far as I'm concerned, Fiore's system uses a probably not a particularly big longsword. Now, I should qualify that in that Fiore in his source makes it clear that he's not particular about the size of the sword, because he talks about big longswords and short longswords and which guards are better with each and so on. So clearly he's talking about a fencing system, and this can be adapted to the weapons in hand. And we see this in his one-handed section as well, where although he shows things with a one-handed sword, he says you can do this with any one-handed manual weapon. You could do it with a stick or whatever. You could do it with a warhammer, or you could do it with an axe. Now, when we come to Fiore's period, there's an interesting thing that I've noted. So this, what I'm holding here, is a replica. It doesn't have a grip on it yet, but you can still hold it. It's an exact replica of a sword from the Alexandria Armory. The Alexandria Armory in Egypt was a large collection, an arsenal of mixture of European and North African weapons that were brought together in an armory, and many of these were captured in war. Some of them were given as tribute, and so on. And when they were brought into the arsenal, they had a date in Arabic put on them. And the nice feature of this, of course, is therefore using the Arabic dating system, we can work out the dates of these weapons. And the one that this is modelled on, if I remember correctly, is about 1414 or 1415, around the time of Agincourt. But what's notable about it is that by any normal standards you would call it a longsword. Clearly that handle is longer than a normal one-handed sword. However, it is not a big sword. It's relatively short blade, only around 33-inch blade, and the hilt is not really very long. It's just big enough to get two hands onto. Okay, if you're touching the pommel as well, and it's actually relatively heavy sword for its size, for its length, and it's an incredibly stiff blade, very, very thick, very, very pointy. And for those of you who know about armoured fighting and European martial arts in general, you might agree with me that this is just the kind of sword that's very, very well suited to half-swording and armoured fighting. It's very stiff, very pointed, and thick, so it's really, really good for the point. It's never going to be an amazing cutter, and also, of course, it's not very long. So for fighting unarmoured, it's not particularly the kind of sword that you might pick. But for fighting in armour and in war, it's a useful item. And I actually think that this type of sword, which is not an uncommon type in this period, is the sort of thing that Fiore is probably talking about and using. So it's not a particularly big longsword. So I think that someone following, for example, a Fiore system would probably do well to work with smaller longswords. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about Fiore and the size of the swords in that system in another point. But the point I want to make here is really about sticking to weapons and weapon sizes and proportions that fit with the system you want to do. So, for me, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to go, oh, well, I'd have an advantage in fencing if I used a really big sword. But a really big sword doesn't fit with the fencing style that I follow. But also, swords are not only about an arms race. As I said before, it's not only about picking the best weapon. If I was going to pick the best weapon, I wouldn't pick a long sword at all. I'd pick if I was sticking to the 15th century, I'd pick a handgun, i.e. a hand cannon, or a crossbow or something. Clearly the sword is not the best weapon. Even in hand-to-hand combat, a spear or a poleaxe or a halberd or a bill are all better weapons than a sword. Okay? The fact is the sword's a sidearm, and this comes around full circle again to context. So when you're dealing with a longsword and picking a longsword and using a longsword of a certain size, don't only think about what's going to give you an advantage. think about what would you be comfortable wearing all day, every day. Because you think how much time you actually spend wearing a sword compared to how much time you spend fighting with a sword. Clearly it's going to spend 99% of its life, or perhaps 100% of its life if you're lucky, in the scabbard at your side. A sword of this size, comfortable to walk around with. Okay, if we go to the Federschwert, okay, you might think, well, it's not that much longer, but look at the hilt. As soon as you start to get a hilt that's very, very long, it starts to stick out and knock into everything and get in the way the whole time. So the shorter hilt in particular is much more practical to wear. And a further thing, people who are using these kind of swords, very often when they fight, they're going to be fighting on horseback. If you have a longsword with an exceptionally long hilt, it becomes a little bit awkward to use in one hand. Okay? If you're fighting on horseback, you're going to be using the sword in one hand, and now we've got a huge, great expanse of hilt sticking out. It's useless to us. So, as with so many things in life, but especially in HEMA, context is everything. Okay? So my request would be that people think about weapons in context. Don't only think about what's the best weapon, what's the most awesome sword, what's the most awesome hand weapon, what's the most awesome weapon, okay? Because that's not what it's about. What it's about is, I want a sword that I want to be able to carry out my day-to-day life with, walk around, walk upstairs, walk around spiral staircases in castles, go into the pub with, jump on and off my horse with, climb up ladders with, all of these things whilst wearing it. And then you want to be able to fight from it in different situations. You might want to fight from it on horse, or on foot, or whilst climbing up scaling a wall, or whatever. You know, so try not to only think of swords in one context because you're selling them short. Think about the sword in all of the contexts that it was designed for, and then you might come up with something. You might surprise yourself. You might come up with a weapon that's actually quite close to what's shown in the historical treatises, and is not necessarily the proportions of the weapon that you might pick to fight one-on-one in a ring with a judge in a modern tournament. Okay, so context, context, context all the time. Thank you.